We have Tim calling in from Washington State. Tim, how are you doing?
Good, Dan. How are you doing?
Doing good. Tim, I like taking calls from you. Tim's a repeat caller of the show because you have a very interesting history and experience. You were in the ministry and you were also a gay man and you kind of figured that out and left the ministry. So your takes are always very interesting. Tim, what do you got for me today?
Yeah. Um, well, God, there was something I wanted to say. Oh, I'm excited because I've got an application in for ACA to be a volunteer.
And, fantastic! Awesome, Tim.
Yeah,
great.
I have to talk with Greg a little bit as well, and there might be some really cool plans in the future. But anyway.
So yeah, shout out to, by the way, just so everybody knows, anybody can become a volunteer at the Atheist Community of Austin. You don't have to be in Austin. Tim is in Washington. Obviously, he just submitted a volunteer application. I don't handle those, obviously. But if you are interested, get a volunteer application on the website and come help us out. We'd love to have as many hands on deck as we can get. Anyway, Tim, tell me what you want to talk about today.
I've got my interview on my birthday, which is Tuesday. I'll be 59. So I've got my interview on my birthday. So that'll be cool. So what I want to talk about is I love reading any books on Jesus mythicism. David Fitzgerald is probably he's kind of the candy bar level of the study because he puts it down at the level that I can understand. But I also like Richard Carrier. And what I've discovered is it seems that based on their research and their studies and everything, that Paul was a Gnostic, or the writer of Paul's epistles was a Gnostic who wrote the epistles. Mark got a hold of it, or the writer of the Mark's gospel, and he created the story of Jesus based on the writings of Paul, or the writings attributed to Paul anyway. And that, you know, how in the realm of Jesus mythicism or Jesus studies, there's always the mention of Q.
Yep.
My thought has been that it's very possible that Paul's writings, or the writings attributed to Paul, would be considered Q, that Mark was actually the creator of the story, and that he wrote very much in the style of Homer, and decided to make this epic story of the Gnostic celestial belief of Jesus, or teaching of Jesus, or whatever. And so that was basically my point, in just thinking, I wonder what Dan and Phil think about that.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to keep my thoughts as brief as I can, because this is actually a really big subject. So I've gotten to talk to personally. I've had personal email correspondence with David Fitzgerald, and I've actually met Richard Carrier in real life. We got lunch, and I've gotten to talk to him, and I've read both of their books. Obviously, Richard Carrier's got like 1 million books, but I've read some of his books, and I've read some of David Fitzgerald's books. He also writes about Mormonism and stuff. David Fitzgerald is not a scholar. He is an author, but his points are very interesting. Richard Carrier is an academic scholar, I believe, in religious studies. So, he has some background there. Don't quote me on that, but he has more academic background. So when it comes to Jesus mythicism, okay, so it's very contentious in the community, because obviously atheists are going to be more inclined to say that Jesus doesn't exist, right? So what's the actual evidence of that? What's the work out there? Well, if you ask the majority of people who study in this area, they're going to tell you that Jesus did exist. So what's the problems with that? Well, the one big issue is, of course, a lot of the people that study this are like people who are in Christian universities and Christian schools, right? So there's, obviously an institutional bias that's happening there. But the other part of it is there's just a lot that we don't know, that we have to piece together about the history of, Jesus in his life, right, and if he existed, right? And so the arguments against Jesus' existence, I find to be extremely fascinating, particularly Carrier's work on the subject. And he is the first to tell you about some of the problems with mythicist theory, like references to Jesus' family members and stuff like that did in fact exist. People saying Jesus' brother, right? But his argument would be saying, oh, well, it wasn't talking about a blood brother, he was talking about like a spiritual brother, right? So there's these quibbles back and forth. At the end of the day, I pretty much remain agnostic on the subject. I really don't know, because I do find some of Carrier's points in particular really interesting, but I'm not going to be the guy that's going to be the iconoclast in this. Like, I'm just a dude who talks on the internet sometimes. I really am not.
Yeah.
I'm not qualified to like make that final call on a subject that is so as contentious as it is. So I'm pretty agnostic as far as the whole Jesus mythicist thing. I'm definitely open to the possibility. There's certainly people who are like, oh no, it's completely fact that Jesus was a thing. I'm open to that not being the case. But if you had to make me bet on one or the other, I would say that I do think Jesus does exist. I do think obviously his story is aggrandized, as you pointed out. The Gospel of John is very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? A lot more sort of Gnostic themes, as you pointed out. A lot more of the whole Son of God coming out rather than servant of God. So, there's again arguments to both sides, but at the end of the day, I'm more in the camp of Jesus existing, I suppose. But I do remain open to it. Phil, do you have a take on this?
Oh boy, you ask me a question like that.
I know.
Do I have a take? By the way, Tim, you might enjoy if you search for the Phil Ferguson show. I've had both Richard Carrier and David Fitzgerald on the show. David's been on a couple times because he's written multiple books, and even some adult-themed books, and some sci-fi books. Really, really cool stuff. So check those out. But I normally say that I think the probability of Jesus being a real person is equivalent to the probability of Hercules being a real person. So, there probably was some guy somewhere 2,000 years ago, give or take, that did some things and people liked him and they started writing stories, but then shit got out of control. It's just like how Marvel accidentally let Sony make a Spider-Man movie. And Sony was obligated to make a movie every 3 years or they lose the rights to make Spider-Man movies. So every 3 years they make a fucking Spider-Man movie and there's 20 fucking Spider-Man movies. The people that wrote about Jesus made money weaving stories. And at some point people cobbled them together, and what part of it is true and what part of it is not, I'm not really that concerned. It's a fun story.
There you go. Phil was shorter than my answer. So there you go, Tim.
I love myths of all kinds, right? Exactly. And so they are wonderful stories. And the story of Jesus, if you don't look at it's kind of like there are a lot of loopholes in a lot of movies that we look at. There are a lot of story blips in a lot of movies that we look at, or a lot of books that we read, but we love them anyway, right? And so, when you look at the character of Jesus in that way, and Dan, I really want to say that I do agree with you as being agnostic. I lean more toward that if there was a Jesus who was alive, there may have been a really sweet guy in and around Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee, who everybody liked, and Jesus. Well, actually, it would be Joshua or Yehoshua. Was a very popular name in ancient Judaism. So anybody could have been first
person of Jesus. Yeah.
On this
no, I agree. And like, again, I really do respect, especially Carrier's takes on this, right? I mean, the guy who wrote the most about Jesus, that being the Apostle Paul, like objectively never met the man. right? Like says so himself. Like the one one of the most influential persons on the works of Jesus, and has never met the dude. And from Carrier's perspective, thinks of Jesus as sort of a spiritual being rather than one that actually physically existed on Earth, which is interesting. And of course,
I love his book on historicity of Jesus. I love it.
yeah.
It's really a cool book.
And you see the development in the Gospels, where John, of course, being the later work of the Jesus sort of mythos developing. And then that's not even including all of the apocryphal works that go even way out there with what Jesus is, right? So I'm fully in the camp of, yeah, there's an argument to be made that Jesus absolutely didn't exist. But the problem is, it's just such a minority opinion. And when you say that, it's just, I don't know, you really lose ground with a lot of people when you go that route. It's much easier to convince folks that, you know, the Christian sort of system, I guess, isn't as much of a thing, instead of going straight for the throat and saying Jesus wasn't real. Because then I've noticed apologists will just attack you, and they'll just be like, oh, but all historians almost unanimously agree on this. And it's only, you know, it's only the radical skeptics that really, you know, and I don't want to lose ground that way when talking with people, right? I'd rather just say, look, whether Jesus exists or not, that is of less concern to me as to whether Christianity is true, right? I think that has the larger implications, and I'm more interested in that discussion most of the time.
Yeah, and I think that the historicity of Jesus is very tantamount to that, but also it really isn't that important that he ever existed as like a normal person. Like maybe he might have been I'm trying to think of a Billy Graham type person, right?
Yeah. I say David Koresh, personally, but that's just me, right?
A wandering preacher.
I'm actually trying to keep it so that it's not as
no, I get it.
Volatile,
not as contentious. I totally get that.
Yeah, and so maybe more of a very popular itinerant preacher that walked around Galilee and preached the love of God or whatever. So yeah. I mean, I get that there's very possibly a mortal being who was the formation or the what's the word I'm looking for? The
seed
of it, or the So, but yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I like the talk. I like talking about Jesus mythicism. You know, it doesn't even have to be a real big, deep talk. Just something, just to put it out there to make people think and think, okay, let's get Carrier's book and read it and see what he says, because he's done the research and he knows what he's talking about, and you know, that type of thing, and get people kind of looking into this.
Yeah. I agree. It's interesting, but I get to a point where it's like, whenever we have this conversation, we're always talking about David Fitzgerald's work and Richard Carrier's work. It's like when we talk about Bible scholarship, we're always talking about Bart Ehrman. It's like, you know, it does make me wonder about our community sometimes. It's like, why do we always go to the same people for some of this? You know, I really wish we could go to some other folks, but that's no fault on them, of course. You know, they're doing what they're interested in, and they, you know, got popular for what it's worth. But I do wish we had some more people contributing that I could cite offhand. But those are the two names that come up every single time this conversation comes up. I'm sure it's the same for you too, Phil.
I think it's because they are the most popular, but also Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy wrote the book Jesus Mysteries. Was the original Jesus a pagan god? It's a great book. It talks about the mystery religions, the ancient mystery religions, and how the myth of Jesus kind of fits in, or the story of Jesus kind of fits in with some of these others. Goes into really deep stuff. It's sort of like Zeitgeist, but better. It's not quite as I guess pablum. It's not. It's they look into deeper deeper points. And they are also two people that talk about the pagan god of Jesus, or the possibility that Jesus was a pagan god. And it's really nice. So Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, find that, because that's good too. I've got it as well. So.
All right, Tim. Well, thanks for that info. For those who want to look more into it, maybe there are some other authors that have talked about. Although I guess they're arguing kind of something different, which is, just as well. Yeah, Tim. I will go ahead and let you go now because we do have some other callers. But thanks as always for calling in, and happy upcoming birthday to you, Tim. Hopefully it's a great one. Phil, any thoughts from that conversation?
No, it's a fun and fascinating conversation. It kind of goes in line with, over the years, I've talked to Christians that, like, for example, I've talked to Christians that believe in reincarnation. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know how that fits in with standard Christianity. I've talked to Christians that would say, I don't think Jesus did any miracles or he's a God. Okay. And then I've even met Christians that said Jesus doesn't exist or didn't exist or didn't live, but I'm still a Christian. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems we have fighting religion in our country is that, 75% of the population, probably give or take, claims that they're Christian. But if you break it down, they all believe in different shit. I mean, there's some common themes, but, is salvation through baptism, or is it through the blood of Jesus Christ? Or are you predestined to go to heaven or hell at birth, like Calvinists say? There's more evidence for Joseph Smith existing than Jesus, and we all know that's bullshit. I mean, that's just comically, stupidly, blatantly, obviously wrong. How anyone can today live in a modern world and have access to the internet and stay a Mormon is beyond my comprehension. But there they are.
Are you making a joke there about Joseph Smith existing? Is that okay?
Well, I think we can document that he existed. I mean, he was in jail, right? So there's records. Where he tricked people and conned people. That was his profession. And he finally hit pay dirt like L. Ron Hubbard by creating his own fucking religion. And the average human being is a sapient moron and just took it and said, oh, well, this guy solved all the problems for me. This too shall pass. And I'm going to follow him out to Nauvoo, Illinois, and then to Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake City.